Recently I was commissioned to make a handle for this guy here, so in today's video I'm going to go through the full process of how I turn big old chunks of ash fresh from the tree into usable handles for my tools. Hopefully this video will be of use to anyone looking to make some of their own handles. I'm also going to put teak where the palm swell happens down here. The exotic hardwood adds a bit of contrast instead of just having it all white, and it fits better in the hand. Without further ado, we're going to start at the very beginning, the actual chunk of wood itself. Now I've had this piece of ash seasoning at home for well over a year and it's just about now ready to work. I got a phone call off the guy who usually fixes my car telling me he was cutting down a load of ash and I could take some if I wanted. So I did. He cut them into 34-inch lengths for me, and then to make them easier to transport and dry out, I split them into halves, quarters and then eighths and left them in a dry area to season. This here is a piece of sycamore. I saw some fellas cutting down a tree at the side of the road, asked them if I could take away this length with me. They said yes, so I'm going to use this guy to give you a quick demo as to how I split my timber. So the tool of choice for this task is of course the froe and our maul here, and we're just picking a point halfway along our log and driving it down. You do want to try and make sure your wood is as straight as possible. This sycamore had a hidden knot in it, which means we can't use them sections for our handles. But it also makes it a little bit more difficult to split. I had to get a wedge involved here. But before long we got it in two, broke it down into quarters and then eighths, and theoretically we would leave this ash to dry in a dry area for about, I left this for about 14 months I think, just to bring it down to a moisture content roughly 20%. This is a state called semi-green, which means it's not really wet like freshly cut timber, but it's not dry like the kind of stuff you would feed through machinery either, but it's really nice to work with draw knives and spoke shaves. So this axe handle was going to be 28 inches long, so I marked that out here with the tape and pretty much cut it. At first I was going to use this big crosscut saw I recently restored for comedic effect, but after I realised this wouldn't work as I didn't have enough throw to play with this saw, I switched to use the still inappropriate rip cut saw, which is usually used for cutting down along the timber, which you'll see in a minute, but here we are now using it to cut across the grain and get our length of ash. I use mostly hand tools, especially in my videos here, just to showcase that you don't need a big fancy wood shop with all sorts of machinery to do wonderful woodworking. I do get a bit lazy when it comes to the head. I used a wire wheel to remove all that rust, and then I used a belt sander to sharpen the edge towards the end, but you could just use some sandpaper to remove the rust and an abrasive stone. I was just trying to get the head part over with as quickly as possible because I wanted to showcase the real event, which was of course the wooden handle. Now when picking out the section of wood we want to get our handle from, we want to make sure that the growth rings are growing parallel to the cutting edge of the axe. You can see they're all flowing that way here. So what I've done here now is taken a pencil, just a straight edge, and marked out a nice straight piece, and I'm thinking the plank we're going to cut from the wood is going to be roughly around here, which means all of this needs to go. Which is fantastic news, because that means we get to once more use our froe. So we plop our length of ash up on top of this lovely piece of limestone I found lying about the field behind the shed. But either way, I've sketched a line down along the length of the ash, and I'm hoping we can stick to that as best we can. So once I have the froe inside the wood, I can't bring it anymore with the maul, so I can pop off the handle, which is the handy thing about most froes, and then I'm just bashing it on either side, working it further and further down the wood. Now our split is beginning to wander away from our line, which is alright because it'd be worse if it was going in the other direction. But either way, I'm struggling to get this froe down any further, so once we have our gap, I can bring up this wedge here and just use the maul to bang these two, and they come right apart in no time. So this offcut we'll toss to the side, but we could possibly get a few smaller hammer handles or maybe even a few hatchet handles out of it down the line. But this here is the main attraction. We pretty much followed the line as best we could. What I'm going to do is get that strapped onto the bench here and we're going to plane it down. So here I have two bench dogs and I'm just going to use the vise here to clamp them into place. And now we can work on our face here. Now the first plane I'm going to bring to this piece of wood is this fella here. He's known as a scrub plane. I bought him in a big job lot off a fella that used to collect vintage televisions. Either way, when I got him he was in poor shape, riddled with woodworm and half rotted, but a few coats of oil and plugging a few holes, and now it's going right well. The secret to the scrub plane's effectiveness is its big cambered iron there that you can see. That allows it to scoop out big chunks of material, which is great for getting down to size nice and quick. It leaves behind all these long channels in the wood, which can be removed by using a finer plane afterwards. But in the past, people have found furniture
with scrub plane marks left behind as a finished surface. So there you go. Now I would be needing a flat surface to plonk my template down on top of. So here I'm using the Stanley number 7 with this big long sole that gives us a perfectly flat, even surface. Here I am using that now to smoothen it down. And there is a template I drew up myself. I sketched this template off another axe I had in the past. Pretty much just traced it with a pencil and cut that out on the bandsaw onto a thin sliver of ash. So here we are now, just tracing that. I wanted to cut my blank about 1 inch thick, and in order to do that I needed another surface that was 90 degrees to our reference surface. So here I am quickly using my side axe, which is a green woodworking tool, to hog off that rough material on the edge there. Next we can use our jack plane here to get a nice flat plane the whole way along our plank. And now I scribe a straight line that we need to cut the whole way along. So here we are once again using a ripcut saw, this time for its intended purpose, which is cutting down along the length of our ash here. Sometimes wood bends in ways you don't want it to. So here I am using a chisel I inherited from my grandfather. I don't think he ever used it for woodworking, mostly opening paint cans, judging by the condition I got it. But here I am using it to split back open the pieces of wood and continuing my toil. I sawed from both ends, and when I kind of got to the halfway mark, I used this big chisel here just to split it off. Next it was time to glue on the 2 pieces of teak for the palm swell, so I just squirted out a bit of glue onto the timber, spread it out, and then attached the 2 slivers of teak. Now this teak came from originally the Liverpool docks. I was up in Northern Ireland visiting a timber framing company, and they had offcuts that were bigger than some of the timber I buy from the shops. So they said I could take away pieces with me, and they pointed out this incredibly beautiful piece of teak here. And I don't know how I made room for it in the car, but I couldn't leave it behind me. And here it is now, going into a piece of ash and continuing its journey across the Atlantic. I forgot to mention that I shaped down the handle beforehand using the side axe, pretty much throwing it up onto the chalk block and spending ages hacking away, precisely cutting off pieces bit by bit with the side axe. Side axes differ from most other axes in the way that they have a single bevel and then a flat side, which makes them brilliant for facing off pieces of timber. This glue up actually took me 2 takes. The first time I took it off, the whole thing just fell apart, even though I had left it for 24 hours. I reckon this was because I left it out in freezing cold temperatures. It hit negative degrees, which it doesn't really do around here very often. So the second time I glued it up, I put it near the heater and the glue seems to have set alright. So here I am now, just using my draw knife to shape down the successfully glued pieces of teak. And this teak was worked relatively well, considering it's about as seasoned as it's ever going to be. This was a fairly satisfying job, and I could have just used a saw, but I instead chose to use this lovely sharp draw knife here. The next step is to find the halfway line right down the middle of our plank here. So I'm using a vernier calipers to measure the thickness of the board, which we know to be 1 inch. Let's just say 24 millimeters. Divide that by 2 and you've got 12 mil. So I set that on the wheel gauge here and I run that up and down the length of the plank, scribing a little mark the whole way along the center. You could probably do this with much more simple tools, but these are the ones I have at hand, so I'm just going to use those. Once we have our line drawn, I'm going to place the head directly on top of our handle here and use this pencil that I've sharpened so that it has a very long lead sticking out the end of it, which makes it easier for us to scribe along the end there. Now I'm just coming along with my tenon saw here, cutting down the slit that the head will eventually sit into. This is a new, I suppose it's an old Spear & Jackson tenon saw, but it's new to me. I got it off an auction an old museum was selling up, and it's unusual in the way that I've never before in my life come across a tenon saw that some previous carpenter has made a sheath for. You can see this one that it just slots right into. So I suppose, yeah, that protects the blade from rust and the teeth from dulling when it's not in use. How brilliant is that? Alright, so now it's time for the meaty bits. Finally get to sit back onto the shave horse and use our draw knives to shape out this handle, starting with where the head of the axe fits onto the handle. So what we're doing here is just shaping it down to that line we drew earlier. that's shaping out the eye of the head. This is probably my favorite part of making any axe handle. So you shape it down, you squeeze the head in to see will it fit. It won't the first time, but it'll leave a mark that lets you know where you need to draw it down to the next time round. And you repeat this process over and over again until you have the head sitting snug. Once we know that our head is fitting, it's time to round out the shaft of our handle. So for that, we're using all sorts of tools, mostly a draw knife and our Shinto rasp, maybe a bit of spoke shaving in there too, but predominantly the Shinto rasp. Although this tool isn't traditional, so it does kind of feel like cheating, I don't know how I'd work without it. Especially for parts like this where the grain of the teak is not flowing with the grain of the ash. I should have thought of that, but I didn't. But Shinto rasp doesn't care, with or against the grain, he'll keep cutting. Highly recommend this tool for any sort of woodworker if you don't already have one. As you can see there, I've also drawn a line kind of halfway on the face of our template there. So that kind of means I can round out between the line we drew on all four faces of our axe handle. Visual cues like that make this job much easier. I am doing this job stood up at the workbench instead of sat at the shave horse. There's really no right or wrong way to clamp your workpiece, whatever works for you. You could quite literally clamp this to the kitchen table and have at it. But for most of my woodworking, I was working at a bench vise. I made a lot of handles at it, and then when I finally got myself a shave horse, I didn't really like the transition. Perhaps if I spent more time at it, I'd be better able and I'd be sat at one right now. But here I am at my workbench, happy out, flying it. It's this part at the bottom of the axe by the palm swell you'll probably want to spend the most amount of time. It's where there will always be a hand positioned, so if you get this wrong, it might be a bit uncomfortable, but that's alright. It's always better to leave more material so you can remove it as you progress with your axe. But here I am now with the Shinto rasp, really taking the time to curve in that palm swell. Now we're on to the cheating part. I've got a wire wheel strapped onto my bench grinder here, so we're just using that to quickly blast off the rust that has accumulated on the head of the axe. Originally when I started restoring tools, I used to use the WD-40 and sandpaper method, but this is a little bit more clean and less labour intensive. But for anyone who doesn't have a wire wheel strapped to a bench grinder, I'd recommend you try the same. Alright, now we're on to our sanding. So I go straight to a 120 grit sanding pad here. A lot of people give out to me for using the ones you're supposed to use on the orbital sander instead of just the standard paper because it's slightly more expensive. But I like the convenience and the shape of the pads. They're strong so you can pull on them with both hands around the shaft, and also they're just not going to fall apart on you as easily. So here I am now, standing up to 120 grit, no higher, because if I were to, the grain would be so fine it would clog up all the pores in the wood and our oil wouldn't be able to penetrate as deep. So as far as 120 grit is as far as you need to go. Alright, now it's time to marry the head with handle, hopefully forever. So first of all, we let Mrs. Inertia work her magic, and then it's time to wedge her into place. I don't have any soft jaws on my vise as of right now, so I just wrapped my gloves around the shaft and locked her into place. And now it was time to drive in the teak wedges. Now I forgot to press record when I drove in the main wedge, but pretty much I glued up a piece of teak, wedged her into place, and I also decided I'd try two smaller wedges running perpendicular to the main wedge, but again, I forgot to press record on that one too. But hopefully you get the idea from seeing one of the smaller wedges going into place as to what I was trying to get at here. Can't cope with it, can't cope without it. Here we are using our coping saw just to cut off all that excess. I left plenty spare here, and then I used the Shinto rasp again to shave down to the appropriate height. I mean, how could you not love the Shinto rasp? Look at it eating into the end grain like it's nothing. Then I get this chisel here, which we use to shave off a nice fine surface at the end. Those exposed fibres will allow the oil to soak in good and deep, which is important because we really do want the wood to swell out where it's touching the head. Now it's time for another highlight, the oiling process. So my current process involves one coat where I mix Danish oil with a small drop of white spirits. The white spirits thins out the Danish oil, meaning the first coat can penetrate good and deep into the wood. I usually apply 5 more coats of just pure Danish oil. giving about half an hour between each coat. Then I use a product suitably named Axe Wax. This helps seal in the Danish oil whilst also giving the axe a nice lovely finish. I much prefer an oil and wax finish on all my wooden handles above a varnish finish. Varnish or lacquer almost creates a barrier between the wood and the user, which I just don't really like. I can't really describe it, but it just kind of looks plasticky to me. So now we have a fairly attractive looking axe, but as it stands it wouldn't cut butter. I remember the day I bought this axe. I was up doing a craft fair up the country. I was taking a stroll about the place around about lunchtime, and the heavens opened and it just started pissing rain. So I ran into one of the tents just for a bit of shelter, and 5 minutes later the rain started to clear and I was walking away with a little rusty axe hanging from my pockets. Had it not been raining and had I not gone into the tent at that point, I probably never would have bought this axe head, and hence never would have made this video you're watching right now. Funny, isn't it? The butterfly effect. But here I am cheating again using this Parkside bench grinder I got from doing a sponsorship campaign with them not so long ago. So I just use that to hone down a nice quick edge on it. But a belt sander will only get me so far. If you want a really sharp finish, you're going to have to use some sort of stone. So here I am using my diamond stones here. Just sharpen it up to 1200 grit. Might be a bit overkill for an axe, but either way we're going to bring it back to our bench and use our strap, which is just a bit of leather strapped onto a bit of plywood. I have a very fine abrasive compound. I think that brings it up to 1800 grit. It also removes the burr and also leaves a nice shiny polished finish on our edge there. Now for the first time in 16 years I've finally stopped biting my nails, which is wonderful because I get to do this new sharpness test. So how this sharpness test works is you place your thumbnail on top of the edge and you pull it back. If it slides right off, means your edge isn't sharp enough. If the edge scrapes a very fine little layer off your thumbnail, that means you've gone sharp enough. I'm sure that'll probably be the last time this axe will be used to cut someone's nails. But how does it perform against an actual piece of wood? We have a fallen sycamore here. I'm just going to play around with it for a few minutes.
So there we have it, lads. That is how I make my axe handles these days. But the fun isn't over yet. I'm going to end the video here, but once you have a new handle, you're supposed to oil it once a day for a week, once a week for a month, once a month for a year, and then twice a year after that. So I've just got some boiled linseed oil here, and we're just going to give it a quick rub in. Thanks for watching, goodbye and good luck.